Hello, welcome to Strictly Money at the News Farm, where all voices matter. I'm Sejal Patel. Since the peak hit in June, commodity indexes have seen a pullback, dropping about 20% and led by oil and gas. While this may provide temporary relief to consumers, what does this mean for your portfolio? With his views on the commodity complex and where the best opportunities are for Canadian investors is Alfred Lee. He's an investment strategist with BMO Asset Management, and he joins me now. Hi, Alfred. Great to have you on.
Great. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the commodity sector, right? But I want to start by talking about oil, because I think it's safe to say that a majority of Canadians are paying attention to oil prices. We have seen a bit of a pullback. What's your read on where prices go from here, especially in light of the supply and demand dynamics?
I think, the pullback that we've seen recently has really been due to, it's more so on the demand side, where obviously, central banks around the world right now, they are tightening monetary policy. So they, first and foremost, they want to get rid of inflation. So in order to do so, they've been raising interest rates, doing QT. So as a result of that, that's kind of dampened things on the demand side. On the supply side, however, a lot of the issues that we've seen in the past continue, right? So I know a lot of people are blaming the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. That definitely has not helped the situation. But when you look at oil overall, and especially oil and natural gas, what we're having right now is there's a lack of capital expenditure. So this was really brought on in 2020 during COVID. When oil prices went negative, a lot of countries really dialed back production. So they've been playing catch up ever since.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, not a lot of companies or not a lot of countries want to invest in traditional fossil fuels right now, knowing that governments are making this big push into things like clean energy right now.
Yeah, interesting point on that. I do want to pick up on the Russian-Ukraine conflict. How much of the price of oil reflects the fundamentals of this? And the reason I ask is, I wonder if it's how much of it is that and how much of it is actually influenced by traders and speculators.
I would say, a good part of it is definitely, the tensions. I would say, traders definitely will add to the volatility, but the underlying structural problems definitely are Russia and Ukraine. I mean, that's part of it. As I mentioned, I mean, when you look at Russia, Russia's the second largest exporter when it comes to oil. And when it comes to natural gas, they are the largest exporter when it comes to supplying European nations with natural gas. But the underlying problem, however, is that if take for example, if you're a company right now and you know that governments want to make this transition into clean energy in the next couple of decades, you're a little bit hesitant to bring infrastructure online, knowing that it's going to take 5 to 6 years to bring it online, and another 6 years for these assets to break even. So there's a real hesitancy to invest in this infrastructure right now.
Yeah. So is this reduction in supply an ongoing reality? And then what does that mean for oil prices going forward?
I think on the demand side right now, as I mentioned, it's going to be a little bit soft because we are potentially heading into a recession right now. So demand's going to be a little bit weak. But on the supply side, I mean, the supply side issues are still going to remain. As I mentioned, a lot of the OPEC plus countries, the question we often get is, well, why can't some of the Middle Eastern countries just dial up and ramp up production to make up for the shortfall? But the truth of the matter is that they're already firing on all cylinders. I mean, they're already near capacity. We've been trying to play catch up, and since the COVID pandemic, since 2020, so we're already at capacity. And as I mentioned before, there's no new infrastructure coming in online right now, which is really adding to the problem.
Yeah. Alfred, we have about a minute till the commercial break. So as a lot of these countries, including ours, push towards this clean energy agenda, what commodities will outperform then?
I think, when you look at things like oil, I think, there is a potential for outperformance there. Obviously, nothing's ever guaranteed, but when you look at oil companies, for example, their profit margins continue to go up. But if they can't invest in capital infrastructure, one thing that we believe is going to happen is that as cash flows continue to build with a lot of these companies, and if they can't invest in infrastructure, the only thing they could do is either invest or increase their dividends or increase their stock buybacks, which potentially will be good for stock prices for a lot of these energy companies.
Okay, we're going to take a quick commercial break. And when we come back, I want to get your thoughts on electric vehicles and how natural gas fits in. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about this push towards cleaner energy. So, Alfred, what does it mean for nickel then, as we see perhaps more electric vehicles coming on?
I think that's a good point. Typically when you look at base metals and other things like, nickel, aluminum, steel, typically, people have looked towards, things like infrastructure built and whatnot for the demand for, things like nickel. But now with this EV, electric vehicles coming online, I think there's a good push towards things like nickel. So not just nickel, but things like steel, and things like aluminum. A lot of these electric vehicles are going to place a lot of demand in terms of demand for just base metals in general. So I think potentially where base metals in the past have been a little bit more economically sensitive, going with the ebbs and flows of economic growth. This is potentially an underlying story that potentially will drive the demand for base metals like nickel as well. So I think over the long haul, I think it is going to be supportive for nickel prices.
Okay. How does natural gas then fit in to this energy play?
I think, as I mentioned before, I think natural gas, it is going to be a huge, source of energy for, the economies in general. When you look at Europe, for example, Europe is heavily reliant on natural gas
Hmm.
and even just fossil fuels in general. I mean, we talked about oil, we talked about natural gas, and we talked about this push towards clean energy. I mean, a lot of the U.S., for example, has a target of moving towards, net zero emissions by 2050. China has 2060, and Europe has, I think, 2045 for a lot of different countries. So until we get there, we're still going to be very reliant on fossil fuels. Natural gas is very much a part of that. And as we know right now, a lot of the European nations, as they're very dependent on Russia in terms of natural gas supplies, Russia could potentially use that as a huge bargaining chip come fall and winter when temperatures get a lot cooler then.
Okay. Alfred, let's talk about gold. Because when I get asked what drives the price of gold higher, I always tell people, it's actually not one thing, which makes predicting its price hard, right? A lot of people thought it was an inflation hedge. It's not really being reflected right now. What's Yeah? Can you talk about a little bit about gold, where you see prices headed, and what's being reflected right now in its price?
Sure. I think you could bring up a great point. I think when you think about gold, people always talk about gold and think about gold as, a hedge against so many different things, right? The way I think about it is it's a hedge against the weak US dollar, it's a hedge against inflation, and it's a hedge against macroeconomic or geopolitical risk. But it could change at any certain time. I mean, the usefulness as a hedge could be very dynamic, where sometimes traders and investors are using it for inflation. Sometimes it's more macroeconomic risk. Sometimes it's a US dollar. So, whereas a lot of people in 2020 were using gold as a hedge against macroeconomic risk, given what was going on with COVID, then we saw a transition into a lot of people using it as a hedge against inflation. But, obviously in the past couple of weeks and over the last month, it's faced a little bit of headwinds.
Hmm.
And the reason why is because the US dollar has been strengthening as the Fed continues to outpace other central banks, arguably other than Canada, in terms of raising rates and doing quantitative tightening as well.
So, for viewers watching, how should they fit gold into their portfolio? 'Cause I know there's lots of different ways of doing it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you mentioned in previously, do you use it as a hedge against inflation? Is it a U.S. dollar? It's very hard to time. But what I will say is that over the long term, if you look at gold and if you say, if I use 5% of exposure to gold in my portfolio, whether it's through gold bullion or gold companies, it tends to be a great diversifier. It tends to reduce the risk in your portfolio. It tends to increase the long term returns as well, and it improves the long term efficiencies of the portfolio. So overall, As I mentioned, very hard to time, but if you use it as a long-term core holding, 5% of the portfolio, it does improve the efficiency of the portfolio.
We only have about 40 seconds till the next break. Does it make sense to hold a gold ETF? And what do they need to think about?
I think so. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, prior to ETFs, it was very hard to get access to gold. It was either through closed-end fund or buying, gold bricks, which obviously are hard to store. But I think ETFs have really changed the game, where now you could buy an ETF that basically just holds gold bullion in a vault for you somewhere, and it essentially trades like a stock. So it's very accessible and very easy to use, and very easy for investors to understand how to trade it as well.
Okay, we'll take another commercial break here and we'll be back in two. Welcome back. I'm here with Alfred Lee from BMO Asset Management. We were talking about gold possibly being an inflation hedge or not, which brings up another question, Alfred, crypto. Because crypto, certainly before we saw this massive sell-off, was seen as an inflation hedge, and its performance definitely says otherwise. Crypto is just such a massive space. But generally, there's this debate that it acts as a currency or it acts as a commodity. What's your take?
I think when you consider it as a currency, I think, where we are right now, it definitely is not a currency. To satisfy the definition of a currency, it has to be a medium of an exchange, which it's not. It has to be a store of value, which it's not. So it definitely doesn't satisfy either of those definitions. But when you say it's a commodity, I would argue that potentially it is a commodity. When you compare it to gold, gold, at the same time has no monetary value as neither, right? It has value because we believe it has value, or because it used to be part of the monetary system. When you compare to digital assets like Bitcoin, Bitcoin, I would say, in terms of a technology perspective, it's definitely a lot more efficient, a lot better than gold. But I think potentially it has the potential to move towards being a commodity, very much like gold. But in terms of being, replacing a currency, I think we're still very far away from that, given that governments likely don't want to give up control in terms of, having their currency replaced by something like Bitcoin at the moment.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about how commodities, the performance of commodities work relative to stocks, right? Because typically stocks, the stock market, over the long run, we see dips, but the trajectory has always been up. That's not necessarily the case with commodities, right? They're more cyclical. So does it make sense to buy and hold, or does someone have to be a little bit more strategic when they're investing in commodities?
It's a great question. I mean, when you look at commodities, commodities definitely have this long super cycle that they go through. But in terms of, buying and holding in a portfolio, from my perspective, it's a great diversifier, because when you look at even your typical portfolio, let's say your 60/40 portfolio, which is your prototypical balanced portfolio, 60% in equities, 40% in fixed income, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, commodities is another asset class that ebbs and flows very differently, as you mentioned, compared to equities and bonds. So as a result of that, it's a great diversifier. The challenge, however, is that, up until 10 to 15 years ago, it was very difficult for investors to access commodities. It was through, a commodity pool, for example. But, with the, innovations in the ETF space, it really has changed the game, where, not only institutional investors, but do-it-yourself investors can now access things like commodities very easily. I mean, as we mentioned before, you could buy a gold bullion ETF. You could get an ETF that accesses gold, oil, or silver. Any commodity under the sun, basically, is accessible through an ETF, even Bitcoin.
But for those people who, I guess, are looking at commodity stocks, right, say gold producers or something else, what do they have to consider? I mean, you're a portfolio manager, so you must have to go through this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because there's so many different ways in which you could access commodities, right? I mean, you could get it through the companies, and the challenge there is that it may not give you pure exposure to, the commodity. For example, if you invest in an oil company, it's not going to be a direct correlation to oil prices. Same thing with gold and gold companies. You could access, commodity exposure through the futures market, which ETFs in some cases will hold futures, but the challenge there is that it could have some slippage depending on what that futures curve looks like. The benefit, however, is that through a futures ETF or an ETF that holds commodity futures, is that you could basically access any commodity you want. The other way you could access commodities is through an ETF that has exposure or holds things like gold bullion. The challenge there, even though it is a perfect way to hold it, is that if you want exposure to things like oil, for example, you can't simply just get a tanker and sits there and holds oil, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
it only is applicable for a few commodities.
Okay. 20 seconds. And a quick question for some of these commodity stocks, are you seeing them feeling the pressure of inflation?
For sure. I mean, a lot of these companies, they've actually been very, they've been able to offset a lot of the inflation,
Okay.
just because as commodity prices go up, their profit margins tend to increase. So a lot, and because commodities have been in high demand, a lot of those inflation pressures they've been able to push on to the end consumer.
Welcome back. Alfred, Canada, very resource based, right? Our economy's prosperity definitely depends on it. How do you think our country is positioned? And maybe the second part of that is what challenges do you see?
I think, in terms of Canada, I think we're very well positioned. I mean, we talked about this commodity super cycle in the past. I think, potentially we are in the midst of the next commodity super cycle. The good news for Canada is that we supply, or we, in our economy, we're suppliers of a lot of the things that the world wants. Oil, for example, as we know, Calgary, Alberta, even on the East Coast, we produce a lot of oil. In addition to that, a lot of the agriculture type commodities we're big suppliers of as well. So essentially, what the world wants right now and what the world has a shortage of, Canada is a big supplier of all those needs.
What do you think the challenge is? Do we have the infrastructure to do this well?
That's a good question, and that was what I was going to get to. I mean, we've all heard about these stories where we have all the oil in the world, not necessarily all in the world, but we have loads of it. The challenge, however, is getting it out. I mean, Keystone Pipeline was canceled, so we have to work with existing pipelines in terms of getting that oil out. We don't necessarily have refineries out here in Canada neither, so a lot of that oil has to be shipped to the U.S. In order to be refined as well. So the challenge, however, is that we're pretty much at capacity in terms of getting that oil and getting those commodities out of Canada until we find new ways of exporting all those commodities that the world wants.
Okay. Alfred, the way I kind of see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is when I look at some of the big drivers that could drive the price of commodities, industrialization probably, in my view, is going to happen more in the developing countries than the developed countries. You have geopolitical risks that can disrupt supply. And a big one that I think a lot of people are keeping an eye on is food security. What do you think that investors need to be mindful of that could be the big sort of drivers?
Industrialization, I think, is definitely a big one. As you mentioned, a lot of the developing countries, as they come online and they want to get online pretty quickly, they're not going to wait for things like the clean energy space to be developed. So until we're heavily reliant or entirely reliant on clean energy, the world is still going to be very much dependent on things like fossil fuels. So I know, as I mentioned in the past, we have very aggressive targets in moving to clean energy, but we can't just transition to clean energy overnight. So it's going to take a while to get there. Even on certain industries, 5 to 10 years is going to be very fast paced. So until we get to being heavily reliant on clean energy, fossil fuels is going to be here, and demand for fossil fuels is going to be very strong over the next decade, I believe.
Do you think food security is something we need to think about?
I think so. I mean, as I mentioned, food security is something that we are running into right now. Ukraine, for example, tends to be a big supplier of a lot of the agriculture type commodities. They tend to be one of the largest exporters when it comes to the agriculture type commodities. We're also seeing things like governments penalizing farmers in terms of nitrogen emissions, which is going to shrink supply for food as well. So that's definitely a concern that I think people have to be concerned about going forward.
Alfred, we have about a minute until the end of the show. Any last minute advice for investors who are thinking about investing in commodities?
Yeah, I think you have to do your research just like any type of other type of investments. I think we talked a lot about the benefits of ETFs and getting exposure, or the ability of ETFs providing exposure to commodities. But obviously, you have to do your research. You have to, as cliche as it sounds, looking under the hood, how does that ETF get that exposure? What's the best way that meets your investment objectives as well?
And how much should someone hold in their portfolio?
It's a good question. It really depends on what the rest of your portfolio looks like. But I would say, in terms of what that commodity makeup looks like, between 5 to 10% of the portfolio would be adequate.
Okay. Alfred, really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Alfred Lee, investment strategist with BMO Asset Management. Well, that wraps up this episode of Strictly Money. Each week, I interview experts on financial issues Canadians care about, from inflation to retirement planning to housing. So if these issues matter to you, head to thenewsforum.ca and catch my previous shows. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.